The rain hadn't stopped for hours. It smeared the city lights into a blur, as if even the sky was trying to wash away the sins that lingered in the corners of New York's underworld. Dr. Elira Moretti stood alone under the hospital awning, a half-closed umbrella hanging from her fingers, unaware that her world was already being rewritten behind the scenes. At 31, she had built a name on her own merit, cardiothoracic surgeon recognized for her precision, her calm, her unwillingness to bend even under pressure. Yet all the degrees, all the surgeries, all the sacrifice in her name meant nothing in the eyes of a family she thought she had escaped. Elira had changed her surname the moment she turned 21, putting oceans of silence between her and the blood-soaked empire her father once ruled. But fate doesn't forget, especially not when the past wears Italian silk, carries a 9mm, and kisses like sin. Matteo Romano had seen her name on the hospital's annual charity list, the one his men always reviewed for potential donors, connections, and hidden threats. He hadn't expected her to still be in New York, much less at the head of an elite surgical unit. The last time he saw her, she was 17, fire in her eyes and a gun in her hand, threatening to shoot her uncle during a family meeting gone wrong. She hadn't, but the bullet Matteo fired minutes later ended that uncle's betrayal. That night she screamed at him through tears. "You're just like the rest of them," and disappeared into the darkness. Now, 12 years later, she had no idea that her father had made one last desperate deal before his death, a pact sealed in blood and rings. Elira Moretti was no longer free, she was promised, to him. The news came wrapped in quiet violence. A letter slipped into her office, its seal heavy with gold and crimson wax, bearing the Romano's crest. Her hand trembled as she opened it, and the moment her eyes met the first line, "By the sacred oath made between Giacomo Moretti and Salvatore Romano." Her lungs froze. It wasn't a proposal, it was a binding. Her heart beat against her ribcage like a bird trapped in a glass cage. She was a surgeon, a woman of logic, precision, and independence, but none of that mattered to men who carved their kingdoms from war and legacy. Within 72 hours, she would be wed to the man she had vowed to hate for life. The man whose lips still haunted her dreams despite the hate she nurtured like poison. Matteo wasn't just a Mafia heir. He was the king, now ruthless, calculating, and terrifyingly patient. He didn't want a wife. He wanted leverage, power, control over the last piece of the Moretti name that hadn't been buried or absorbed. But when he saw her at the engagement dinner dressed in black silk, eyes cold as winter, he realized something unexpected. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She looked him in the eye like a queen walking into war, unarmed but unshaken. That made his blood burn. She wasn't a pawn, she was a storm. The ceremony was private, surrounded by the who's who of organized crime. No family from her side, just the ghosts of what she used to be. She said the vows without emotion, but Matteo noticed the way her fingers clenched, the slight shift in her breath. He leaned in, lips brushing her ear, and whispered, "You're mine now, Doc. There's no scalpel sharp enough to cut this bond." She didn't reply, but when their lips met for the obligatory kiss, fire surged through both their veins, resentment laced with longing, anger dripping into forbidden hunger. It wasn't love. It was something darker. Living with him was a new hell. She moved into his penthouse under full surveillance, her every move watched, every call monitored. He gave her freedom within golden walls, a lavish prison disguised as luxury. But what Matteo didn't anticipate was her resistance. She didn't cower. She didn't try to escape. She worked 12-hour shifts, came home covered in blood that wasn't hers, and stared him down across the dinner table like he was just another diagnosis she had to dissect. The tension between them grew sharper by the day, not just emotional but physical. Sometimes, in the silence of night, she would wake up to find him watching her from the shadows. He never touched her, not without consent, but the air crackled between them, full of things they hadn't said, of betrayals neither had truly confessed. The betrayal that broke her heart wasn't just the forced marriage, it was the lie behind it. Her father had always claimed to be done with the Mafia, yet he sold her like a final offering, and worse, he did it to protect her. Matteo revealed it one stormy night when she confronted him after finding a folder of documents detailing her kidnapping threat from a rival clan. "He gave you to me," Matteo said quietly, "because he knew I was the only one who wouldn't let them take you." She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just walked to the window, stared into the rain, and whispered, "I would rather have died than be owned." But it wasn't ownership that Matteo sought, not anymore. Somewhere in the cruel game of power and legacy he had begun to want her for real. Not just the name, not just the leverage, her. The woman who wouldn't break. The doctor who saved lives with the same hands that slapped him across the face during their first real argument. And as for Elira, despite every scar he represented, every ghost that trailed him, she began to feel something she feared more than the past: desire. Their first real kiss wasn't at a party or in the heat of an argument. It was quiet, intimate. He had walked in late from a meeting, bruised and bleeding from a street confrontation. She had tended to his wounds silently, gently, and when she was done, her fingers lingered too long on his cheek. He looked up, searching her eyes not for dominance but for something he didn't name, and she kissed him, soft, unsure. It wasn't a surrender. It was a beginning. Still, peace was a fragile illusion. The enemies of the Romano family were watching. Whispers grew louder, that Matteo was changing, that love was softening his rule. And in the underworld, weakness is blood in the water. They planned to strike, not at Matteo, but at her. Because if there was one thing they had learned in centuries of war, it's that a man like Matteo Romano could survive bullets and betrayals. But love was fatal. The attack came on a Thursday night. Elira had just finished her shift and returned to the penthouse, her body sore, her thoughts a chaotic storm of feelings she hadn't yet named. Love was never supposed to be part of this deal. Neither was heartbreak, but it had snuck in like a slow poison. Matteo hadn't returned her calls all day, and something in her chest ached, something raw, instinctual. Then the lights went out. The silence that followed wasn't natural. It was too still, too thick. She barely had time to move before the glass exploded inward, masked men swarming into the penthouse like shadows. She grabbed the scalpel she always kept on her, slicing through the arm of the first man who reached her. Blood sprayed. Screams followed. She fought like hell, but they weren't there to kill her. They were there to take her. She almost made it to the staircase before a blow to the head dropped her to her knees. Her vision blurred. The taste of iron filled her mouth. A voice, familiar and cold, whispered, "Tell your husband this is the price of loving a Morty." Then everything went dark. She woke up bound in a warehouse, hands tied, bruised, heart thudding so loud she thought it might rip from her chest. But Matteo came, alone, no guards, no snipers. Just him, walking through the fire with fury in his eyes and death on his breath. What followed wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter. Gunfire echoed like thunder, blood spilled like water. And when the smoke cleared, Matteo stood over the last man, covered in blood, chest heaving. He looked like a god of war, and when he saw her broken, battered, shaking, he dropped to his knees and untied her with hands trembling. "You came for me," she whispered. "There was never a world where I wouldn't." They didn't speak much on the ride home. His hands never left hers. He stared at her like he needed to keep seeing her breathe to stay alive. Once back at the penthouse, she collapsed into his arms. He carried her to the bedroom, laid her on the sheets, and undressed her like he was unwrapping something sacred, pausing at every bruise, every scrape like they were sins he had to atone for. There was no rush in the way he touched her, no dominance, just aching need. His lips moved over her skin, memorizing every inch, every sigh. She cried silently, not from pain, but from being seen finally, completely by the man she swore she would hate forever. He kissed her tears, murmuring, "I'll spend my life protecting what I never deserved. I'm not a possession." She whispered, "No," he said, voice hoarse, "you're my salvation." When he entered her, it was slow, deep, and devastating. Their bodies moved in sync like violence and grace had finally made peace. His hands cradled her face, her nails dug into his back. They breathed each other in like oxygen. She moaned his name like a prayer and a curse, and when she came undone beneath him, it felt like the breaking of chains that had bound them for years. They didn't sleep. Not truly. They clung to each other through the night, tangled in sweat, whispers, and promises that no blood oath could ever match. By morning, the sky was clear. The war was over, and for the first time in her life, Elira wasn't running. She was home, in the arms of the man fate forced into her life, but love carved into her heart. Not every story begins with choice. But this one ended with it, and she chose him forever.